Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Fighting Matters. I am Steve Kwan from BJJ Mental Models. I got my pal Jesse Walker from Rough Hands BJJ on the line. How's it going, Jess?
Steve, how are you? I'm still full from Thanksgiving, so.
And you've already got the Christmas tree up, man.
Here. And we got the tree up, right? Yeah.
You don't waste time. Like, the minute Thanksgiving is over, the tree is up. I can respect that.
We love our holidays at this house.
Understandable. Well, we've got a cool guest on the line today. We've got Adrian Nathan West on the line. Nathan, my friend, how's it going?
Things are good.
Nice. I'm glad to have you here, man. Now, why don't you give everyone a quick intro? We're going to talk about the New York Times article that you wrote recently. I believe it's titled "The Athlete Trolling His Way Through Jiu-Jitsu's Culture Wars." This is a great piece on Craig Jones and some of the online battles he has had with our friend Gordon Ryan. But before we get into that, maybe give yourself a quick introduction, because in addition to training jiu-jitsu, you've got a pretty accomplished background in terms of your writing and authorship work.
Sure. So I'm really a novelist and essayist. So I have a novel called My Father's Diet, which, if you're, it doesn't have jiu-jitsu in it. It does have a little bit of pro wrestling, and it has some weightlifting in it as well. It's a father-son story about a father who sort of loses his, I won't say his sanity, but things start to fall apart for him, and he enters a physique transformation challenge. I write a lot of book reviews for a lot of different media. I write very frequently for The Baffler. For them, I've written about steroids. I've written about drill music in Philadelphia. So I try to stay busy. Yeah.
Nice. And let's maybe introduce the piece as well. So this just came out very recently, and it was all over Reddit. Of course, got shared a lot on the internet, as you can imagine. It's nice to see a piece in the New York Times that I would say is kind of a uplifting and a bit of a good thing, because normally when jiu-jitsu gets covered by major outlets like the New York Times, it's because something terrible happened. So it's nice that this time that's not what happened. But why don't you go ahead and talk about what you wrote?
Or it's funny that you mentioned that, because I kind of looked through the New York Times before I did the pitch to see what's been written about jiu-jitsu before there. And so they have The Athletic, which has been sort of spun off, and they have had some jiu-jitsu coverage in there. But the main thing, of course, is the Cyborg and Fight Sports story, which, as you say, is not the best story for jiu-jitsu. What happened with this really was I wanted to write a story about CJI-3. That was the original plan. I got in touch with an editor there, and she was quite nice, and we discussed a little bit back and forth what would be the best approach. Given that it was going to go in the New York Times Magazine, which is the Sunday supplement. So if you buy it in print, if you're one of the 4 people listening to this who buy the newspaper in print, it came out today. And what she recommended was a column called Screenland. So Screenland can have to do with television, it can have to do with movies, but it often has to do with viral internet phenomena. And so that was something that really fit. And so we decided that we would focus on Craig Jones, and particularly Craig Jones's expert online trolling. And something that was important for the paper was, how can we make this connect with a broader audience, and how can we draw out some bigger themes here? So naturally, I'm a jiu-jitsu fan. I was perfectly content to just write about Craig Jones and hilarious things that he did on the internet, but we wanted to pull that out a little bit. And so that's what we ended up doing, and looking at how jiu-jitsu can sort of feed into politics. And that ended up being sort of the thrust of the piece.
Yeah, it was a really cool piece, just kind of recapping this online battle between Craig and Gordon that has been going on for so long, and is really, I think, in many ways elevated Craig. Gordon, of course, arguably one of the best jiu-jitsu athletes of all time, certainly the best in no-gi. And Craig has really managed to explore and build his reputation outside of just being number one on the podium, right? I mean, being behind CJI, so many other initiatives, and just his ability to get attention and content create on the internet is something that is super impressive. Maybe talk through some of your main findings on this piece, what you kind of found and discovered, and what you concluded based on after you'd written this thing.
So what I can tell you is, I'm not a big social media guy, and I've spent a lot of time on Instagram looking at these posts. So in fact, I ended up downloading Craig's entire social media history from Instagram to kind of go through it. And one of the things that was interesting to me, because I didn't know, I didn't even have an Instagram account actually before something like 2020, and I really only use it for research. I didn't realize that actually he'd been quite involved with charity stuff from the very beginning. So if you go back and find him when he's a purple belt in Australia, he would be kind of raising money because so-and-so had cancer, raising money for this sort of charity. And then it was quite nice early on to see that he was traveling around and had this sort of young and kind of misty-eyed, oh, I'm in America, I'm doing this for the first time and that sort of thing. But what we really looked at in the piece was jujitsu in its relationship to politics. So what I think is important is this. If you look at previous generations, I think it was often the case that a person would evaluate someone according to their politics, and that would determine whether they like them or not. So they'd say, well, I trust this guy because he's a Republican and I'm a Republican, or something like that. And I think that as the parties are starting to fall apart, you're starting to get this situation where actually people are looking for somebody that they vibe with, and then they'll get their politics from them. And the marquee example of that, I think, is Joe Rogan, who obviously has a ton of influence in the jiu-jitsu world. And you can't really classify Joe Rogan on a left or right axis. I think he's probably tending more rightward, but he can change in that regard. And so I think people go, okay, I trust Rogan, and then they listen to what he says. And you know, do I think that people are logging on and saying, well, what does Gordon think about this? That's what I'm going to think too. Not exactly, but I don't think that that's not happening either. And so, what we looked at is the way that Gordon had originally tried to go viral by being nasty to people. So that was his thing. He would challenge people, and he would say, he would pick somebody who was a grade of jujitsu and say, oh, this guy, he sucks. But then that sort of veered into, I'm going to be really obnoxious because that attracts a certain type of person online. And so it was interesting to watch Craig take that in a different direction, and it's curious to me because, for example, you mentioned that Gordon is arguably the greatest no-gi grappler, which is certainly true. But I think we also have to think is, okay, what does that really mean? Like, how old is no-gi jujitsu? If you say that somebody is, if you take Alexander Karelin, right, and you say maybe this guy's the greatest wrestler, well, wrestler is a sport with a long lineage and so on. Gordon is bragging about something that is impressive, but in a certain sense is a very short-term thing that's happened so far. And I think that it was nice to have Craig come along and say, well, that's cool, but actually we're just a bunch of sweaty guys in shorts rolling around and acting weird. And so to be posting things like Gordon posted during the pandemic, well, in World War I, people lost this many people, and then they faced the Spanish flu and all this. And to have a person like Craig take a little bit of the air out of that, I think was important.
I would agree completely. I mean, Gordon has quite a large platform considering the relative smallness of the sport that we train. And it has been frustrating to see him use that platform to really promote a lot of dumb stuff. I mean, I got to be honest. A problem that I have quite often now with jiu-jitsu personalities is I see them post incredibly stupid, misinformed stuff on social, and I get myself to thinking, man, if this person is so wrong about everything else, can I even really trust that they're that right about jujitsu? I mean, it seems weird to me that you would post these crazy unhinged takes about everything else, but just in this one space in jujitsu, you've got it figured out. And of course, this is a challenge that we have in our sport. Really any sport, but jiu-jitsu especially because it's an individual sport. So much of individual performance is not just about how much you know, but about how athletic you are and how much of a hard worker you are. And I think sometimes that can give a lot of these athletes overconfidence that they actually know a lot more and are a lot smarter than they maybe otherwise would feel, right? Given their level of knowledge of other things in life. So I think sometimes that gives these guys and girls a false sense of confidence about how much they know. Next thing you know, they're on their soapbox spouting off all of this politics stuff that is so clearly misinformed. The interesting thing about Craig, like you said, is he was kind of very enigmatic for a while. It's only been in the last year, maybe last few months, where he's really been more open about his political beliefs on the internet. For a long time, I really wasn't sure where he sat on things. I mean, quite famously, he went on Alex Jones, right? I mean, when I saw that, I thought, fuck, that is a bad look. Like that is a really bad look and a huge mistake. And I didn't know what to make of Craig at that time. But you look at him now, and as the world has gotten more polarized and politics has become harder and harder to ignore, he's been more outspoken about things like the evils of racism, and I've seen him post like pro-vax statements. So he's definitely started to get more comfortable living in that world. What are your thoughts on this? Just kind of the politicization of martial arts like jiu-jitsu. It's getting to the point where this kind of stuff is hard to ignore.
Yeah, it's a difficult issue. What I obviously generally think is you should try to talk to people in their field. If you cut your foot open, you shouldn't log on to Reddit. You should go to the doctor and ask him what he thinks about your foot or what she thinks about your foot. If you want to know whether the Earth is round, you should probably not consult Eddie Bravo about it. You should consult an astronomer, and so on and so forth. In the case of Craig, what I admired was a certain lack of seriousness with it too. I remember him talking about the COVID vaccine, and he said, "Well, I know people who will take drugs that they found off the floor, but won't get vaccinated." And so I think that he was wise enough to say, you know, martial arts people are probably not the people to consult about that. And I think he would even say, I'm not the guy to consult about that. You mentioned him with Alex Jones. I think that in some ways, he's very clearly a person who will do things for the sake of the experience. And I understand that being on Alex Jones' show is an experience. And I think that also he probably thought that he was going to get a little more juice out of him than he did. So I was a fan of the El Segundo podcast. And if you listen to his episode with Alex Jones, it's one of the few that's really kind of a dud, because I think that he thought he would get Alex Jones to say some really crazy stuff. And Alex Jones, what you find is that if he doesn't have his shtick, he doesn't really have a lot to say. And so he was on there and he wasn't ranting and screaming. And so he was kind of nothing really. And so, you just finally get the marquee moment where Craig chokes him out, and that's a little bit of something for us. Um, but yeah, I think it's a problem because people shouldn't turn to athletes for their thoughts about politics or about all these other things. But at the same time, it's very natural. People can't help it. They like a person, they feel associated with them, and they do look up to them.
A challenge I have had to learn and deal with is realizing that people don't always make decisions about information rationally. In an ideal world, we would all be completely rational and logical all the time, but we're human beings. Human beings don't do rational things all the time. And the whole thing about taking advice from athletes outside of their athletic area of expertise, that's a perfect example of that. There's a lot of young men who listen to what people like Rogan say, even though really that's probably one of the worst sources of information you could get on many of these topics. But they like him, and they've got this parasocial relationship with him where they've listened to him speak for hours and hours and hours, and that creates this bond, this feeling of trust that goes beyond expertise and merit, unfortunately. So we live in this world now, almost an idiocracy in many ways, where influencers have this outsized ability to spread information, or in many cases, misinformation. And again, I will cite Gordon as an example of that. The amount of just straight up bad information, incorrect information that he posts on social is crazy. He just posted a message the other day calling for the death of Democrats, right? I mean, I think you probably saw this as well, but after Trump's statement about how, implying that the death penalty may be on the table for the 6 Democrats who put out that ad saying you must disobey unlawful orders. Trump put out that thing about how, this should be punishable by death. Gordon was all in on that. I mean, he used his platform to agree and say that, in situations like this, killing politicians makes sense. That is a wild, wild take, regardless of your political beliefs. And the problem is people like Gordon, they appeal to really, really young men. And maybe young men is not even the right word, because a lot of these are going to be minors. They're going to be young boys who love jiu-jitsu, and they haven't learned how to think critically in the real world yet. So if their entire feed is populated by folks like Gordon, that's going to be where they get a lot of their opinions from. What are your thoughts on the responsibility of athletes in this space? Should they be using their social like that to try to dispense and disperse influence in their opinions? Or are you of the mind that, as so many people say, we should keep politics out of sports?
Well, I think it's a quite complicated issue. So on the one hand, it seems evident to me that people shouldn't be bad people. You should try not to be a bad person, but that's not very specific advice, okay? But what you've made me think of is a piece I read on Substack recently. Unfortunately, I can't think of the author, but I think if people are listening to this and they want to Google around, they can find it. But it was an article about political divisions. Okay. And the author was hypothesizing, and I think he's largely correct in this, that in many ways the left right opposition doesn't work very well anymore. And so he was looking at populism. And so one of his questions was, why do we have left wing populism and we also have right wing populism? And his question was, why do left and right wing populisms often have things in common? And he turns to an idea that was made very famous by the behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman, which is fast and slow thinking. Okay. And so what he essentially says is that you have a part of the population that they think fast and they think intuitively. And those are people that populists appeal to. And then you have people who are willing to think more deliberately and think in steps and be patient and take time. And those people can be appealed to by other political figures. And this isn't necessarily a left and right issue, but the example he gives is if you want to explain how a vaccine works, okay, this is slow thinking. If you're a non-scientist, it's very, very difficult to read that literature and to understand it and to begin to grasp it. And most people simply don't have the patience for it. And if they're a fast thinker type and they tend toward intuitive solutions, then what they're going to do is look at people who give them the right vibe and see what those people say. And if you're a big ripped dude with tattoos and you think Future Kimono's gear is cool, you're going to look at Ryan and you're going to go, oh, well, what does this guy say about it? Um, you know, I would like athletes to stay out of this stuff. They're never going to do it, though, because you have people who 24 hours a day, they have a microphone shoved in their face. And this is true whether it's athletes, whether it's actors, whether it's musicians, and they're always going to offer their opinions about it. In an ideal world, I love them probably to act otherwise. But even with Craig Jones, you run into an issue. Craig Jones makes a lot of jokes about sex and drugs. I happen to think they're hilarious. Would I think they were as funny if I had kids, for example? I don't know, because, I might be more cautious about, for example, those jokes about drugs and stuff like that. So you get into an issue of how do parents regulate, what their children see on the internet and stuff like that. I can't say that I think athletes should be more responsible, except in the sense that I think everybody should be more responsible. Everybody has a moral duty to be a better person, right? So.
Yeah, and that is really where I struggle with the approach a lot of people take on social media is it just seems so depraved in many ways. I really believe that part of the reason we train martial arts is because of the pursuit of betterness of the self. We want to be better people. That's why we do this. It's a vehicle for getting better and being a better person. And to see some of the best in our sport just post these incredibly misinformed, divisive things on the internet is really challenging to me, especially when often that standard is only held one way. I mean, Jesse knows this. We just got a comment yesterday in our feed from someone saying that once again, the common criticism, you need to keep politics out of jiu-jitsu. You shouldn't be talking about this stuff. I check his username. His username is Next Scamdemic. And so I'm thinking, okay, so I'm not allowed to express my political beliefs,
Right.
but you can literally name yourself after a far-right anti-vax conspiracy theory, and that's okay. So why is it that I am held to the standard that you yourself will not hold yourself to? And this has very much been a challenge that comes up whenever people, like yourself in many ways, kind of push back on some of this toxicness in the sport, as people say, well, this doesn't have a place here. But then you'll see Gordon or Jake Shields, literally profiting and grifting off of this kind of stuff now. I mean, you look at some of the stuff they're doing with Derek Moneyberg, literally not just posting this stuff, but trying to turn it into a profit center. And their fans are okay with that. And again, I think that comes down to like what you said. It's not always a rational decision. It's a fast brain decision, a tribal loyalty decision. We do that. We support this guy not because what he says is right, but because we want to support him. We've already decided he's our guy. He's in our tribe, and whatever he says goes. And I think I think the mistake that many of us make when we try to attack this with rationality is assuming that you can reach these people with just more data and more facts. And I don't think that works, right? I think that in many ways, an appeal to emotion and tribe is probably a stronger way to reach these people. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, there's research that goes into this too, and I think that's absolutely true. Are there people that can be convinced by rationality? Obviously, but you can see those people because they're rational people. So this, I think, is another difficulty with a so-called left-right division. That let's take an issue like immigration, which can be very divisive. Well, I, in general, am quite pro-immigration. I'm perfectly willing to talk to and respect a person who could be extremely anti-immigration. if that person wants to have a discussion about, whether it be the economic effects, whether it be the cultural effects, whatever. But that's a process of having a discussion where you state a fact, I state a fact, you state an opinion, and we go back and forth. If you're Gordon, you can't have that discussion, because Gordon is just going to post an idiotic meme, or his video of himself pretending to be a fucking, pardon my French, pretending to be a border control agent or whatever. And you know, you're not going to change that with reason. What would change it? Well, I'll tell you, for example, in the case of Gordon, what would change it? If Trump came out tomorrow and said immigration was great, the next post on Gordon's Instagram would be about how immigration was great, probably, because he's decided that that's the right kind of guy for him to have the same opinions as. Um, you know, how do you get to these people and how do you change them? I think it's a very difficult issue. So if there's always going to be people whose mind you cannot change, that's a fact, right? But I don't think it's so many people. But then I think that there are these groups where you need to look at how the appeals were made to them. So if you look at something like the Democratic Party, an approach was taken, let's say roughly from 2018 to 2022, of let's make people feel really bad about themselves and then they'll change their opinion. And I think that that blew up in a lot of people's face. And we saw that this actually was a really terrible approach. And I would say this specifically with regard to a lot of sort of male-centered issues, which is something, that I have a certain interest in. And so, at the same time, you want to understand people, and I think we should always try to understand everybody, and we should always try to meet everybody where they are. That being said, what you can't do, if you look at a person like Gordon or even a person like Trump, these are people that are incredibly whiny. You can't just let them sit there and throw a temper tantrum and validate everything that they're saying, because the things they're saying often aren't valid. So what is the real truth? The real truth is it's probably going to take ages to get through these issues, right? They're very, very difficult issues.
Yeah, definitely not easy. Jesse, you look like you got a question there.
Yeah, so I guess, given Craig's approach, um, what is the conceit in your eyes? What do you think he's accomplishing by his kind of online persona?
Sure. Well, it's certainly very entertaining. I have to give him credit for that. So, as I say, for me, really, I use Instagram for things that I am researching. I don't have any posts or anything like that, but I do pretty routinely check it because it's very funny. And I think that that humor has the simple value, which is making you laugh. I think it has another value, which I mentioned at the end of the piece, which is ridiculing something that people take too seriously. And on the one hand, maybe that knocks the people who are too serious down a notch. And then on the other hand, I think it takes those of us who are having fun and sort of floats us up a little bit. And we go, okay, I'm kind of doing the same thing as this guy. Like, I'm just trying to have a good time and I'm just trying to joke around. And I think that that part is nice. But you can also look at things that Craig has done that are really good. So I think if you look at the Guardian Project stuff, this is undoubtedly something that's really lovely. If you look at what's happened with athlete pay, so he literally trolled Bo Jassim into paying athletes more, which is a pretty big deal. And I think with CJI, is this the future of the sport? I don't know what he's been able to do with women's pay. Is it sustainable? These aren't things that I have an answer to, but what they have done is set the bar in a different place so that, if you're going to offer, a Theon Davies or a Sarah Galbao or whoever, if you're going to say to them, 2,000 for a super fight, they have a leg to stand on when they say no. So, I would say that at least in our small world of combat sports, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, I think that's great. It was interesting, we've talked about, the concept of purity testing and that sort of thing a number of times on the pod. Uh, I'm really curious about kind of the response from both sides, and maybe even in particular more on the left leaning side. I mean, I think I saw some comments on Reddit of like, how can you give this guy any credit for being a positive? He had Alex Jones on his podcast. And, if there's any missteps on, the left side of things, again, we're holding ourselves to this standard that nobody else is holding themselves to. Are they able to hear that message? Are they able to see kind of the good and the positive influence that he's having? Or is everybody just angry?
You mean people that are more left leaning?
Yeah.
Um, I can only speak for people I know personally. And I feel like, yes, so one of the things is it's the internet, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? So like the people that complain the most are going to be the people that tend to get the most likes on their comment or, can get the most followers or whatever. And so I think we do need to abstract away from that a little bit and look at where people we know are. So for in my case, because I travel a lot, I train at a lot of different gyms or whatever. And so, you know, I feel that he's got a lot of fans, and I feel that he's got a lot of fans among those sort of left-leaning people, but these aren't necessarily people who are online virtue signaling all the time, as you say. So, when you mention the people that want to have a purity test, these are the people that are all over the internet, and they're constantly showing off who they are because that's their purpose in life, is to show how virtuous they are. Those of us who don't want to do that, we don't wake up in the morning and go, oh my God, I need to think of something awesome about myself to post to show people how great I am. And so you may not see those people's reaction. But I think from people that I know personally, I think that he has quite a following. And I think it's evident on the internet that he has quite a following too. So I do think that he's getting embraced by those people, maybe not by the squeakiest wheels, but these are people that are going to be hard to win over no matter what, right?
How about things on the right? Gordon's brigade of goons that come
Yeah.
after people when they write anything negative about Gordon. Have you come across any of that stuff?
So I haven't gotten in my email. What I have gotten, I was curious to look, email, that's advanced technology, right? So I've looked to see some comments and stuff. One of the things I've seen is, you know, why can't we just keep politics out of this? And you start to say, well, I did write an article about that. You could read the article rather than comment about this and so on. I had obviously people say, uh, are you so somebody had a comment that one of you guys deleted, I think, about me being gay and autistic, or when did I come out to my mother, which is pretty classic, like Gordon IQ level material. Um, but I haven't had any real strong engagement. Probably the closest thing would be a couple of people asking me if there really is this right-leaning tendency in jiu-jitsu. And I think some people doubted that. Um, I understand that doubt because what I find personally when I train is individual guys that I meet or that I roll with, they don't express those opinions. And it's probably more likely even that I would see those more left-leaning opinions. But as you mentioned, Steve, when you start looking at high-level athletes or when you look at coaches and stuff, this is where you really start to see the weirdness express itself. Now, what I believe is that two things. One, I think that a lot of these people are more comfortable expressing themselves on the internet than they are necessarily saying these things in person. And then I think two, people feel that they can't express those things until maybe they get to a coaching level or to a high level athlete level. And then they say, oh, well, I won PANS, so I'm obviously a genius. So let me tell you guys what I think about voting machines.
Well said. Well said. Um, I would love to know, maybe we could talk a little bit about the process of getting this done. I noticed that when you did your AMA on Reddit, there were a lot of questions from people asking, number one, what is the process like of getting an article into the New York Times? And number two, how can I do that? If I have an interest in the written word as a medium and I want to maybe make a job out of this, what does that look like? I mean, anyone, of course, can go in, post stuff on Substack, but I think many people are not really aware of the level of diligence that has to be done if you want to make it into a paper of record. Could you maybe talk about what that process is like? Like, how do you even convince the New York Times to do an article on an Australian jiu-jitsu guy who's famous for shit posting? Like, how do you fact check? How do you get published? What does that look like? And how would that be different from me just posting on my blog?
It's a good question. And it's kind of a funny question because one of the more frequent things that people asked me was, well, why didn't you include this? Well, why didn't you talk more about this? And I think at one point I said to somebody, well, listen, it's not like I turned to Mr. New York Times and say, listen, I'm going to write an essay about this Australian guy you've never heard of. Can I have 6,000 words to tell you about how hilarious it was that he sold this guy's Miata? It actually is a more difficult process than that. And, for me, it was kind of a miracle to get that piece in there. So the way the process started was this. I had originally hoped to cover CJI 3, or CGI 2, I'm sorry. And my thought had been, I want to go out to Vegas and I want to try to hang out with these guys and really do a sort of portrait of how it happened, why it happened, and so on. And I pitched that to a couple of places and I got a positive response, which I hadn't necessarily anticipated. But, one place said, "Oh, it sounds great. We don't have enough money." One place said, "Well, we've got an MMA piece coming out, so we really can't do it." And so I happened to have a contact with an editor at the Times, and she was really lovely. And she said, "This sounds great." I think I was fortunate because the Craig story is funny. And so you can include some things in a pitch email that get a chuckle out of somebody. And they say, okay, well, maybe this isn't just, men in underwear beating on each other, right? And so she responded and she said, well, I think what we can try to do is this piece for the Screenland section in the New York Times Magazine. And so then, I sent in a first draft and she was quite happy with the first draft. Then there was a waiting period. And then you're asking about the process. So then what happens with the process is, well, this thing is unclear. This thing will be difficult for non-jiu-jitsu practitioners to understand. We need to have some of this so that people who don't know anything about jiu-jitsu will understand why they should even be bothering to read this article, and so on and so forth. And so what ended up happening is, I'd put a piece in, I'd take a piece out, I'd move a piece up here. So for example, the original piece began with an explanation of the B team breakup. But then we found that there was a problem because one, it was based on innuendo. Two, to go into it takes up a lot of space and I had only a certain amount of words. So we ended up cutting it. And then once you get something that looks like your piece, then it goes to fact checking. And the fact checking is insanely rigorous. So that was something where I was really quite impressed with the work that the fact checker did because it's really every single detail. And then, once that's done, you sort of get one final edit and then it goes out. So
I noticed someone asked you and basically said, when you wrote this article, you were talking about Craig's drug use. How could you do that without any proof? And you responded, basically said, like, look, I can't share details, but all I can tell you is the New York Times fact checks things really rigorously. And
yeah,
I think this is a challenge. I think this is a challenge people on the internet sometimes struggle with, right? Is they want all of the data presented to them specifically. They want to know and they want to see they want to see the tea spilled. They want to know all of the drama and all of the details, but they often don't understand that, there's such a thing as an anonymous source. You can't always just burn your sources that way. Sometimes you have to trust the paper of record or trust the outlet that, hey, we did this. We can't tell you how we did it, but we did fact check this. And that can be very unsatisfying to people who already don't trust the media, right? What are your thoughts on that? Can you maybe explain that process of like how you validate and fact check these things, but at the same time, how people can know to trust these sources even if they don't know the details?
Yeah. So it's a difficult thing. I think there's even a psychological difficulty with it because we don't live in a very discrete era. So, it's a common thing to see, for example, I'm on X, you go on X, and people will have a spat with somebody and they'll post screen caps of their text message exchanges. These are things that for a certain generation of people are utter madness. And for another generation of people, they come very naturally. And I think by the same token, it's difficult to convince some people that there is such a thing as professionality and that professionality is often based on relationships of trust and relationships of confidence. Me knowing that you're not going to go on the internet and say what I said to you about something like this. And obviously, when you get to the level of writing for something like the Times, this is very important. And this is another thing people also don't understand. This is a part of what I do for a living, and so if you do these things for a living, you need to your relationship with your editors is more important than your relationship with, whoever on Reddit, for example. And I don't owe anything to a person on Reddit. Having said that, skepticism in the media, I think, is a difficult issue because one, we know that skepticism is a virtue. We know that people should be skeptical of things that they read. But when it's just your knee-jerk reaction, then you're not actually being skeptical. You're just being a dick, if I can put it that way. So, for example, I thought about this because today I read an article in the Times about a Russian general who had been trained in Kansas And then he had gone back and he had fought in the Ukraine war. And it was a very interesting profile of this person. And there's no point where you would read this and say, oh, this is fake news. It's very self-evidently well-researched and sympathetic, and it's not judging the guy and it's not pushing a political line. And so when somebody starts yelling fake news, I think, well, they didn't read this article. They're just repeating something that they heard. I don't think there's anybody who has a subscription to the Times and is calling it fake news. You may disagree with editorial pages, but again, this is a problem where I think a lot of people don't understand that editorial pages aren't the news. There's the news stories and there's the editorial section and there's restaurant reviews, which may be subjective. And I don't think people understand that those things are different. What I would have to say is that, things get checked. That's all I'll say. I won't say things never slip up, because we all know examples of that happening. But I would have to say the process is very, very rigorous. That's all I would really say about it. Even to give you an example, I mean, rigorous to the point of, do you really know these people? Can you give me this person's email address? I need a screenshot of this. I mean, really every single point of the essay.
People often don't understand that, if you publish something that is patently false and disparaging of someone, you open yourself up to a ton of lawsuits. And the bigger you are as an organization, generally the deeper your pockets are, and that makes you a much more attractive target for big lawsuits. So, I mean, this happened recently up here in Canada. The CBC recently did an article on this far-right MMA neo-Nazi event that happened in British Columbia. And a lot of people in the martial arts were slamming the CBC and saying, this is the fake news media. I can't believe they're getting away with slandering these martial artists. And I keep having to tell people, like, the CBC is a crown corporation up here in Canada. They are a massive news outlet. They are a very, very attractive target for lawsuits. If they're going to publish something that specifically names someone and outs them for attending a Nazi event, they are going to have the facts absolutely buttoned up. Like they're going to make sure that if this went to court, they could defend themselves without any doubt. People like this, companies like this and organizations like this don't just post shit for drama and clicks like you would get on social media, right? There's real stakes for a news outlet because one bad statement and they can have a lawsuit after them. And I mean, man, it's not just the possible loss of money. There's the risk of going to discovery. Nobody wants to be at the end of a high-profile lawsuit that they're not likely to win. So when a news organization, especially a large one and a publicly funded one or a public company, when they post something like this, they probably have done the work to back up their statements and they're willing to defend it if they have to. You can't get away with just throwing out false information if you're a major news organization, unless you're like Fox News or something. Somehow they do it, right? I mean, obviously there's a line because, again, sometimes you can hide behind editorial and opinion and entertainment. But in many cases, for organizations like the New York Times, I mean, they are a journalistic paper of record. If they were to just start publishing fake stuff, they would get assaulted by lawsuits and they would have no leg to stand on.
And let's be honest, I would like to think that everybody is in the New York Times offices right now talking about how wonderful my article was and, how did we ever get this guy, Nate West, in the paper? But the reality is probably that it's not worth it to the New York Times to have an article about a jiu-jitsu guy and have it be any sort of risk, So evidently that the due diligence has to be done on a piece like that. This wasn't a big scoop that they were ready to jump on.
Yeah, I have a question too about defending your work as a journalist. I mean, we have seen some situations recently where media companies have basically just capitulated to the Trump administration and thrown money at him in the face of a frivolous lawsuit that they easily could have won. And I think sometimes people, when they see a lawsuit, they think that it's as simple as like you won or you lost. And if someone is willing to throw money at a settlement, that means they must be guilty. The situation right now is obviously quite different. Can you talk a bit about that and about journalistic integrity? I mean, with a lot of these other news outlets that have been kind of bending the knee to Trump in many ways, there are rightful concerns that maybe the free press is losing some of its value and some of its trust. And although I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories, I think it's fair to say that, man, you look at all of these companies that will start firing their journalists because Trump tweeted something. And we should probably wonder about the integrity of these institutions and whether it will hold and survive this administration. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that stuff's terrifying. I mean, I don't want to use this term because it's a term Elon Musk used, free speech absolutist, but I would say I'm pretty close to a free speech absolutist. I believe in freedom of speech, obviously. I believe in freedom of the press, even to the point of opinions that are repugnant to me and so on and so forth. I find the situation very worrisome. It's also a situation where there are often explanations there. So, when you see a phenomenon such as, an owner of local TV stations chooses to ban Jimmy Kimmel because it turns out that they want to buy more TV stations that are currently allowed by law, and they're currying favor with an FCC official and so on and so forth. We can see what the roots of these things, and I think that there was a similar situation maybe with Paramount, although I don't remember that very well. We clearly have a president who is not immune to the lure of money, who's not immune to the lure of flattery, and who's extremely resentful and extremely vengeful. To see people capitulate is really depressing. I'm fortunate because, one, I'm not somebody like Maggie Haberman. I'm not one of these people who's covering Trump all the time or something like that. I write occasional long-form essays for outlets like The Baffler, who are incredibly supportive and who also aren't touching these issues. But it's incredibly worrisome, obviously. And what's worrisome, too, is when people like it, So I think that if you are on the right, again, in the past couple of years, the right has really come out and said, we're the ones who support free speech, and the left doesn't support free speech. They're for speech codes and they're for wokeness and banning things and so on and so forth. And now the shoe is on the other foot, and it turns out that, well, actually, no, if I don't like this guy, then it's totally fine for him to not have his opinion. And that's, of course, very worrisome. Now, I should say there are people on the right who do defend free speech, absolutely, and who have come out against those things. And that's good. But, it's worrisome. Now, do I think that it's going to define the nature of democracy? I don't think that Trump's winning these battles in the short term. It's evident that the press here in the U.S. remains very free. And that's something that makes me happy. But of course, it's worrisome. And, people say this about freedoms. If you don't exercise them, they're not really freedoms. So, it's definitely people have an obligation to continue to do that.
Jesse, you've got that I've got a question look on your face.
It's still percolating.
Okay, well, I got one in the meantime while you're thinking of that.
Yeah.
I got one I wanted to ask. Something that I've been really interested to watch is the growth and the rise of independent media, and how much that has been accelerating in ways that I didn't expect. I mean, friend of the show, Karen Attiah, who was recently fired from the Washington Post because she criticized Charlie Kirk, has really been making waves on independent media, building up a really successful Substack, cross-pollinating with a lot of the other really popular independent media outlets. And many of them, like, Don Lemon, for example, are folks who were part of traditional media and went independent. Now, of course, YouTube has been democratizing access to publication for quite a while now, but the criticism that you can make of YouTube is there's also a lot of slop and kind of low effort content on there, in addition to some good stuff as well. What I didn't expect was the growth of something like Substack, where you're seeing these just independent accounts basically become really effective journalistic outlets. I mean, at this point in time, if someone were to ask me where should I get my US-based news, I don't think I would say go to CNN or go to the Washington Post. I think I would say, like, sign up for Heather Cox Richardson's Substack or something like that. There's a lot of really great stuff happening at the independent level. Now, the challenge, of course, with being independent is you don't have that whole machine behind you that you just talked about, where you've got like armies of fact checkers and editors. If you're independent, then there's nothing stopping you from just writing a screed and posting a button or pushing a button to publish it. But on the other hand, I think that a lot of the luster has been lost from traditional media, especially in the last year, as the capitulation to the Trump administration has really understandably made people like myself question whether traditional media really holds itself to the same standard that it used to. What are your thoughts on this rise of independent media? Do you think that's a tectonic shift, or do you think that's kind of a flash in the pan that might just go away?
I think neither. So if you look at Substack, and I'm not an expert on this subject, but if you look at people who monetize it, I think there's a very quick fall off. So you mentioned Heather Cox Richardson, who is somebody who I think is doing very well on there, and you have a few numbers more, but then I think that after that you start to fall off, and pretty quickly you get to level of people who can maybe get themselves a DoorDash meal once a week. So I don't see it that the old media is obsolete and everything is going to turn to Substack. I think that's going to be very difficult. I do like the platform. You mentioned slop on YouTube. There's a lot of AI slop on Substack. There's a lot of very badly written stuff on Substack. There's a lot of interesting stuff. So to give an example, Joan Grillo, who is a British journalist, writes about drugs and drug policy, and particularly cartels in Mexico. And, Grillo is published in many places. He's published books. He's published in the New York Review of Books and so on. But, he's found success on Substack, and I think it enables him to write a type of story that would be hard to publish in other places, and also a type of story that never fits very well with anybody's particular ideology, because drugs are an issue where really I think that both the quote left and right have got a lot of things wrong, because they're really not dealing with the situation as it stands. And I admire what he does a lot, and I think that he probably thrives there in a way that he couldn't thrive in traditional media. That said, I think the fact-checking apparatus is important. I think the reach is important. I think that increasingly, as the internet becomes more AI-written text, which I think that don't quote me on this could be fake news, but I think that there are some estimations that say 50% of text online now is AI-generated. When you get to that point, I think that a traditional medium has a certain importance where you can say, okay, there is an editor. There are 3 editors under that editor. There is a fact checker. There is a hierarchy. There's someone to appeal to when this is wrong. You know, um, obviously some traditional media are going to fall. I hope that others rise up in their place. I certainly think that an editor is an important thing, and a lot of people on Substack need an editor really bad. But it certainly is an important supplement to my media diet, and there are Substacks that I read for sure.
I think you bring up quite wisely this problem that many of these platforms have, which is that the people at the very, very tippy top eat well, but pretty much everyone else is just getting, a few dozen views a month. And often these platforms oversell their importance because they can point to a handful of creators that are doing really well. YouTube is notorious for this. For years and years, they publish all of these stories about, we're creating jobs. Look at all of these people who are getting rich off of YouTube. Man, you can count those people on your fingers. There aren't that many of them. The vast majority of people who publish on YouTube, they just go nowhere. And even the people who have a decent sized following still really struggle to monetize it. So I agree with you that, there needs to be an incentive long term for people to make this content, and that's got to be money. People have to be able to pay the bills if they're going to do this stuff. I don't know if social media has really figured out the way to solve for that yet. And I think that AI raises all sorts of interesting questions. I mean, this is obviously a hot topic right now. I see in the jiu-jitsu space a much greater willingness to adopt AI than I see in creative spaces. Jiu-jitsu people love it. I mean, AI memes, they throw them around. They think it's just the greatest thing. People who work in the creative arts obviously hate it. As a journalist and a writer, I would love to get your thoughts, your realistic thoughts on AI, what you think this is going to do to journalism, to writing in the future, and any advice that you would have for someone who's just getting started out now, knowing that this is coming down the pipe.
It's very hard to say because it's hard to say where it's going. So, we very recently, Sam Altman was telling us that, GPT-5 was going to take all of our jobs and was going to be AGI and all this other nonsense. That clearly has proven not to be the case. At the same time, it's clear that it does something. And another thing that's clear is there's a theory, I guess in economics, right, which is it's called something like the theory of good enough. And the thing is this. If you're the head of Wendy's and, what people really like is to have a counter person who interacts with them and who serves them, but you can make more money by giving them shittier service, you'll probably do it, right? And so this is part of the thing is if you say, well, for example, I'm a literary translator, and this is one of the ways that I make a living. Machine translation is very good. Now, I don't think that it's as good as human translation, and I think it misses many things that humans have. But who who are the people who care about that, and it may be too small a list of people for us to matter. So certainly for me to sit there and try to tell a publisher, well, I need 5K or 10K or 20K to do this book that you can get DeepL to do in 30 seconds because I can give it that human touch. And that person may look at a pile of money and look at me and go, nah, it's fine, it'll be okay. So I'm certainly worried about it. That said, what we found with AI is it is really doing pattern recognition on historical facts. We certainly aren't even anywhere close to having a system that can synthesize contemporary events and do anything very interesting. So, I think writing in journalism is sort of safe, but let's say sort of. I'm not 100% confident at all.
I think that often the benefits of and the risks of AI are kind of misrepresented in many ways. I mean, there's no question that it is supplanting jobs and impacting jobs, but the question is whether it's actually doing a good job of replacing them, or if executives are just using this as an excuse to slash staff. And I think it's probably the latter. I don't think this is going to create a situation where everyone's jobs are replaced by computer. I think a lot of greedy execs are using this as a chance to cut costs. They're using it as an excuse, but I don't think there's evidence yet that it's really going to replace people. It might automate or reduce the effort on a lot of really manual grunt work, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think of back in the 80s when word processors and automated spreadsheets like Microsoft Excel were going to put all of the accountants out of business, right? People are like, oh, why do you need an accountant if you have Microsoft Excel? Well, it turns out you do still need accountants. And in fact, tools like Microsoft Excel just allow them to get much more done quicker. And that actually, in some situations, can even grow the field because now it's easier for someone without a huge budget to get access to really powerful tools. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to kill an industry. It might just reshape it in some ways. I think in the short term, we're going to see a continued amount of job losses as companies try to use this as an excuse to slash and burn their staff, much like has been done in the past with outsourcing. I wouldn't be surprised, though, if there was a whiplash at some point where, for a variety of reasons we don't have to get in here, it either moves the other direction or it finds a balance, or even there's a reckoning, right? I think there's a very good chance that all of these people that have been laid off because of AI, I mean, the flip side to this is those people can now start their own companies, and using AI, they can probably get done what would have taken a team 5 times the size just a year or two ago. So this could wind up actually biting a lot of these greedy businesses in the ass if all of these people use AI to build more viable competitors, right? That's a very common thing that happens when disruption like this goes on. So I am not totally a doomer when it comes to AI and what it's going to do to these fields, but I do think that the grosser thing about AI is not just what the AI, it's not so much what the AI does, but it is the way that people are using AI to do shitty things to people. That's kind of the main thing that I'm concerned with.
Yeah, I mean, I worry about it a lot with to go back to translation, right? Because it's an example that's close to my heart because what I do all the time. Okay, so I translate everything word for word. I don't use any AI. I don't use DeepL or that type of thing. But I know for a fact that a person can run a book through DeepL and they can sort of check it against the original and they can do it much faster than me and they can get a result that's probably fine. What do I do about that? Do I just stand there and say, yeah, but I'm the last guy that's not doing this, or whatever? It's something that's quite worrisome, in the same way there are definitely people out there, and this is something that people have spotted examples of, and I've seen it posted many times, people who are working at major media outlets where they've gotten busted for using, ChatGPT to write stuff. And you want to say, well, our standards should be higher and people will recognize this stuff. And you hope that that's true. And I think it generally is true. But it's worrisome. It's worrisome if you're sitting at a table with a pen in your hand and you're really thinking hard about something. And some other guy's like, write me 5,000 words about Craig Jones, and then all of a sudden he's got the essay and I don't.
Jesse, it looks like that question may have percolated now. Do you want to ask it?
So it did. And Nate, this is going to circle us back to the article, I guess, especially since we're getting close to the hour. Knowing that people like Gordon Ryan or Donald Trump are in some ways so injured by ridicule.
Mm.
Um, is the Craig Jones approach? Should we all just become internet trolls, and as a way of dealing with this kind of far right madness? Is that a lesson that we should be taking from the article?
I don't think so. I think that some people should, because some people are good at it and some people enjoy it. I'll give you an example. I couldn't do it. It would just exhaust me spiritually, and I actually don't like being mean to people. So, if I had contact with Gordon Ryan, if Gordon Ryan was a person who listened to me, I think I personally would, sort of want to try to understand where he was coming from and try to maybe talk him off the ledge on some issues or something like that. Because it's not that I'm a believer in the inherent goodness of people, but it's just something that I just don't like being a dick. It's not something that I really enjoy. But, the truth is, probably I would try some sort of, soft understanding approach, and it probably wouldn't get anywhere. So, the trolling probably is getting somewhere, and it certainly is at least getting people to question that, and getting some people who maybe didn't feel comfortable admitting how uncomfortable they were with it to do so, and to know that they have allies out there. So, what I tend to think is we need a lot of different types of people, and, we do need some trolls, but definitely everybody shouldn't be a troll. Also, some people are really bad at it. One thing about Craig is he is talented at that. He's good at doing it, I don't know that I think I could probably be a good troll, but I would feel terrible about myself. I just can't go online and be mean to people, It's just not me.
Amazing. Well said. Well, I mean, that's all of the questions I got. Jesse, anything else on your side?
No, I mean, I think that was a great note to end it on.
Well, thanks for doing this, Nate. I will put a link in the show notes to the New York Times article. But why don't you plug your stuff? If people want to check out your work or your website, where can they find you and more of you?
Yeah, please do so. If you want to see any of my work, links to everything are archived on anathanwest.com. Some of the stuff is paywalled. You can email me from there if you want to see a paywalled article. I'll send you a PDF. My novel is My Father's Diet. I very much recommend that you guys look for it. And then I want to put in a plug for The Baffler. The Baffler is one of the main places that I write. I've done articles on steroids. I've done articles on cocktails. I've done an article on Philly drill music. It's a magazine that I really love, so I hope you guys will check it out as well.
Awesome. And I noticed on your website, you've got a page that just links out to all of the articles you've written and all of your work. So I will
That's
put
right.
that in the show notes to make it easy for people to find. But thanks a lot for doing this, man. I think it is super cool to see, again, content about jiu-jitsu making it to the Times that isn't just a total indictment of the people in the sport. It's nice to see that as a change of pace, since most of the time it's something about fight sports or some other heinous thing. I thought it was a really cool piece. I'm impressed that you were able to get that through and get them to approve something like that, which is so niche and specific to us. But I think I think messages like that are important to put out into the space, both because they kind of set the tone for the sport in the way that I would like to see it set. And also, I think it promotes aspects of the sport that need to be getting more awareness as well. So thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nate.
Amazing. Yeah, and thank you to the listeners, too. Appreciate everyone, and we will talk to you in the next one. See you then.